What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi. Today, I wanted to take a little bit to talk about the 10th edition Tyranid Codex, my first impressions of it, and a big issue that exists with the Codex and how it interacts with the updated balance data slate that came out recently. Now, over the last 2 weeks or so, I've played close to 20 games with the 10th edition Tyranid Codex, running through a wide variety of lists with a bunch of different detachments. My recordings of those games are actually going up on the TacticalTortoise TV YouTube channel if you want to go watch those. But my first impressions are kind of lukewarm. I think the internal balance of the Codex is unfortunately very bad, and I don't think that it's actually the fault of the Codex itself. There are a couple detachments like Invasion Fleet and Synaptic Nexus that I think are perfectly competitive and actually probably pretty strong moving into the metagame. They're a little bit straightforward, they're kind of stat checky and don't have a lot of agency within the game, but they are very good, and if you want to play Tyranids competitively, I think they're an excellent starting point. The other detachments, however, I think are hamstrung by the ways that Games Workshop has elected to balance some of their internal mechanics after the Codex was already written. That's really, unfortunately, keeping down their level of competitiveness. The issue stems from the autumn 2023 balance data slate. Now, let me preface this by saying that the balance data slate, in my opinion, was absolutely great. The metagame of Warhammer 40k, the balance of different factions, and just the playability of the game is so much more improved from the pre-balance season, where we were being dominated by just a couple of factions that had wildly beneficial mechanics. Unfortunately, the way they tried to rein in some of those mechanics was by making some universal changes to the ways that stratagems are unlocked for free by unit abilities or duplicated with units like the Nexos, who could use a stratagem multiple times. Unfortunately, both of these abilities were restricted to only working on battle tactic stratagems. This was due in part to some factions abusing defensive stratagems or stratagems like Overwatch to be able to fire multiple times in their opponent's turn, which is incredibly strong. So they elected to make this change universally to all stratagem duplication abilities. Now, generally speaking, this wasn't a huge change for a lot of factions. Factions like Space Marines or Adeptus Custodes have a lot of battle tactics in their roster and rely, I wouldn't say wholeheartedly, but to some extent on free stratagem abilities like Rites of Battle or Gilliman's free stratagem aura. Restricting the use case of these abilities isn't the biggest of deal for these factions. However, when it comes to the Tyranid Codex, things are very different. Tyranids for the last couple of editions have been built around the Hive Tyrant. In 8th edition, they were your mobile damage dealers. In 9th edition, they were really the focal point of the army. And kind of the fantasy of Tyranids has been sort of a swarm of lesser bugs, but all kind of centrally controlled by this Hive Tyrant in the middle. And that was represented in the Tyranid Index upon the release of 10th edition with their ability to, you guessed it, use free stratagems. Every Hive Tyrant, besides the Swarm Lord, who has his own ability, has an aura that allows you to use one stratagem for free per turn and or duplicate it if you've already used it before on a Tyranid unit within 12 inches of them. Now, not only did the data slate create some open rules loopholes, especially with stratagems that target multiple units and how exactly they interact. If you have a stratagem that targets multiple units, does it count if they're all in the aura? If you have a stratagem that targets a friendly unit and an enemy unit, does that count for the aura even though the aura only affects friendly units? I think the usefulness of those stratagems is questionable at best. But the real issue is that you can't use stratagems for free or duplicate them unless they're battle tactics. For most of the detachments in the Tyranid Codex, this isn't that big of a deal. Invasion Fleet, Unending Swarm, and even to a lesser extent Synaptic Nexus have some good battle tactic stratagems that they can use alongside these abilities. And as such, the Hive Tyrant giving you an extra command point economy within those detachments is very strong, and for that reason, those detachments tend to be the strongest ones in the Codex. The issue arises with the other detachments who don't have battle tactic stratagems available to them. One of the biggest culprits for this, in my opinion, is Assimilation Swarm, which has a lot of very powerful stratagems, only one of which is a battle tactic stratagem that's usable alongside the Tyrant's aura. Whereas the detachment is generally speaking based around a lot of, at some points, high cost stratagems to keep their harvester units alive, regenerate units, and debuff the enemy for attacking their harvester units. The fact that they can't use any of these abilities alongside that Hive Tyrant aura makes the detachment significantly less powerful. In addition, the stratagem Broodguard Impulse was also written specifically to synergize with the free stratagem effect. However, it is not a battle tactic, meaning that after the Codex was written, it was then retroactively changed to be anti-synergistic instead. This stratagem in particular gives your entire army, all of your Tyranid units, a +1 to wound buff against an enemy that destroys one of your harvesters. So you'd think that if you lose a harvester unit, you can target the enemy with that stratagem and give yourself a buff against that unit. No, that's not how it works. Instead, you target a harvester unit at the point at which it's destroyed. Why does it work this way? It's specifically so that because the stratagem is targeting a Tyranids unit, the Hive Tyrant aura then works on it. It's kind of a convoluted targeting sequence. You target the harvester when it's destroyed, it then checks the unit that is currently destroying it and then applies a debuff to them, specifically so that it can work alongside these auras that buff your stratagems. However, it unfortunately now no longer works this way, meaning that there's now this sort of vestigial organ of a targeting mechanic within this detachment that no longer matters. Vanguard Onslaught is another good example of this. 4 out of the 6 stratagems in the detachment are strategic ploys, which means they don't interact with the free stratagem abilities whatsoever. In addition of the 2 battle tactic stratagems in the detachment, one of them targets enemy units, so only 1 stratagem out of the 6 is synergistic with the Tyrant aura. It's one that gives you precision to your infantry, which is kind of corner case useful at best. However, they gave Winged Hive Tyrants one of the keywords to make it synergize with all of the other detachment abilities, so you're incentivized to take this extremely expensive character who was points increased in the data slate update and who now no longer works with the detachment stratagems whatsoever. It's clear to me that the balance of the Codex was decided upon before the change to duplicated stratagems was implemented. And this isn't just the case for Tyranids. This has also affected other armies. I think Imperial Knights is a good example, where they now have a single stratagem in the entire game that Canis Rex can use with his free stratagem ability. They even took battle tactic off of some of their other stratagems so that they specifically couldn't be used with Canis Rex, and I don't think the implications of that were entirely considered. And overall, in my opinion, it speaks to the fact that this specific data slate change was made kind of hastily, and I don't think without really considering the implications. The Tyranid Codex otherwise is incredibly cool, incredibly fun, and were you to be able to use all of these stratagems together as was originally intended, all of the detachments, or at least I would say probably 5 out of the 6 of the detachments, were of pretty close power level. I think the internal balance of the Codex was incredibly close. With the kind of haphazard way that this change was brought into the game, I think that there's only maybe 2, potentially 3 detachments that you would ever consider playing in any sort of competitive format. And I think that is really unfortunate for the Tyranid Codex. They take some of the most interesting and unique detachment ideas from the Codex and basically just threw them in the garbage. Largely this is because these stratagem categories were kind of assigned at random, because at the time that stratagem categories were assigned to the stratagems, it didn't matter which category they were because there were no mechanical differences for having a strategic ploy versus a war gear versus a battle tactic stratagem. And now they're sort of reaping the detriments of just haphazardly applying these stratagem categories. And I think that Tyranids unfortunately got burned by that. And it really kind of takes a lot of the wind out of my sails for the faction. I do think Tyranids are relatively strong. In my opinion, however, if you want to play an actually strong army, you're kind of restricted to playing a Synaptic Nexus or maybe an Invasion Fleet. Attrition-based stat checklist where you have a bunch of resilient monsters and you pump them up with your defensive abilities and then hope that you can kind of force primary out of your opponent that way. Unfortunately for me, that's not really the faction I'm interested in. I like the faster, lighter stuff, and it doesn't really feel that viable to me with this change being implemented. And I largely want to make this video so that I don't have to mention this anymore. We'll just talk about the cool stuff you can do with Tyranids. Anyway, that's all I have to say about this issue. Let me know down in the comment section what you think about it and how you have been liking the Tyranid Codex. Thanks everyone for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.